Good evening. Thanks for inviting me to join you tonight. I apologize if I cough or splutter or sneeze along the way. We're getting over COVID, which was from a couple of weeks ago. I think previously you've been looking at various Bible characters, such as Timothy and Silas and Lydia. So tonight I'd like us to look at Epaphras, but we'll get to more of that in a moment. This is basically the outline for tonight. A brief introduction first, but then two major parts. One basically focusing on Epaphras, who is often overlooked or considered as an unsung hero, perhaps. And a second part thinking about what it might mean to actually carry the gospel and how we might do that. And I'm hoping that we'll have two breakout sessions. So we'll do the bit about Epaphras, have a breakout session, come back together and have a second one at the end. But that's the plan, if Stephen can hit all the right buttons and I don't confuse him too much. So here we go. In several New Testament letters, Paul talks about examples, people being examples, following examples. Here's a verse from 1 Corinthians. It basically says that, doesn't it? It's pretty clear. In Philippians, again, following an example and being a model. And another one from 2 Thessalonians about following his example. It's a common theme that Paul shares, and an encouragement for the people who are listening and perhaps for ourselves. So here's the first part, thinking about who are your heroes? Who are the people that you would like to take as an example and imitate parts of perhaps what they do? Here are some of mine. Now, some of them can be fictitious, fictional characters. Anybody recognize these?
Yay, Gandalf.
Yay, Gandalf. And the other chap?
That's with Foyle's War.
Yeah, DCS Foyle from Hastings, yes. Some people might be actually real life, but kind of, sporting stars or film stars or musicians or whatever. Earlier on, we were talking about cricket. Yeah, well, so there we are. Surprise, surprise. I've got a few cricket heroes. But other also just relatively ordinary people. Here are a picture of Amagana and Ruth Gindo and their little girl, Esperance. They lead the navigator work in Mali and have done now for nearly 10 years. The other chap, just don't know if you can recognize this guy. His name is Malcolm Clegg. He's married to an American lady called Jules. They live in Poland. He's been involved with the navigators for decades in Central and Eastern Europe in particular. And more recently, living in Poland, he was supporting churches in Ukraine. So, surprise, surprise, he has been touched by the events in the Ukraine and has been involved in supporting and hosting and helping various Ukrainian refugees. Sometimes there are some biblical people that we might want to imitate. So Paul was talking about how he could be one person. Sometimes they're high profile people. Of these two pictures I've just added, the one on the right is supposed to be a representation of Daniel. And everybody knows some of the stories of Daniel about with his friends going off into exile, being willing to kind of not bow to the pressure that was put on them by various authorities. Other stories that are very familiar are perhaps him being thrown in the lion's den. But that happened when he was, they think, in his 80s. And even that wasn't the end, because he goes on, this is the chap who interprets the writing on the wall that came to one of the last kings or emperors of Babylon. The picture on the left is a representation of Epaphras, and we'll get into a little bit more about him in a minute. But I think the question I was going to ask was to think about what is it that makes people the kind of people you want to imitate. And I think for me, the things that attract me are to do with integrity, to do with a desire for honesty, to do maybe something to do with skill and knowledge, but it can also be very much a question of their heart and the commitment to follow Jesus. Those are the kind of things that I would tend to look for. So, on to Epaphras. Epaphras is a Greek name, and it's supposed to be a shortened form of Epaphroditus, which apparently means lovely. I suppose today you might say handsome. And we get to look at just 3 passages. He's only mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Twice in the book of Colossians, once to the letter to Philemon. So there's not an awful lot to look at, which makes it manageable, but at the same time raises lots of questions. And in a sense, we're going to have to perhaps do some imagining and maybe a little bit of speculation too, just to imagine what it might have been like to be in his shoes at certain times. Before we get into those, just a quick kind of summary reminder about the letters to Colossians and Philemon, or Philemon, or whatever is how you say his name. These are both New Testament letters attributed to Paul, written in round about the year 60 AD. Some say 59, some say 61. They're part of a set called the Prison Letters, and they think that Paul was actually in Rome at that time, although there are other alternative ideas. And they were written, the Colossians was written in a response to various questions that were coming up. Particularly, Paul writes about the person and the work of Christ, and then as an answer to a question about syncretism and heresy that was threatening the churches in the area. These, sorry, I'm trying to move this around. Well, that's better. These churches are in towns, all in the same valley, to the east of Ephesus, and it was often written as, well, thought to be written as a letter that was sent around to 3 different churches, not just to 3 different towns, not just to Colossae. The letter to Philemon was a personal letter from Paul. Philemon is thought to have been a wealthy businessman. Move this again. Living and based in Colossae, and it basically concerns a runaway slave called Onesimus. The issue being that if Onesimus was caught, there were severe consequences and punishments on the horizon for him. So Paul's letter is predominantly about asking Philemon to be kind and generous and gentle with him, because Onesimus has become a follower of Jesus as well. That's kind of the general, broad context of these letters. So, on to the first of the passages that specifically mention Philemon. No, Epaphras, I mean. There we go. So the first one is in Colossians 1, verses 6 to 8, and it says, "The gospel is bearing fruit and growing throughout the whole world, just as it has been doing among you since the day you heard it and truly understood God's grace. You learned it from Epaphras, our dear fellow servant, who is a faithful minister of Christ on our behalf." So, in terms of what do we learn about Epaphras? Well, we already say it's a Greek name. He's mentioned just 3 times. This time it looks like he's the guy who brought the gospel to Colossae. And if Paul is writing about him and saying he's a dear fellow servant and a faithful minister of Christ, that's quite some commendation for somebody who's not well known. The second passage is also Colossians, but this time chapter 4, and it's verses 12 to 13. And it says that Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He's always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God and mature and fully assured. I vouch for him that he is working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. From this, it's thought that Colossae was probably his hometown, but obviously he had connections in the other 2 towns. Prayer is clearly important for him, and he is working hard for all 3 groups of believers. And here's the third passage in the letter to Philemon, verses 23, 24. It says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greetings. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So this suggests that not just a colleague, but he's actually in prison with Paul, possibly in Rome. And he's certainly well known to these other names, Mark, Demas, Luke, Philemon, which basically means that this guy is known to two gospel writers, as well as the author to most of the books in the New Testament. Interesting. But that's it. That's all the Bible says about him. So why does he intrigue me? Why is he a hero for me? What exercises my mind a little bit is thinking about somehow God met with this man. And Epaphras understood what the gospel was about and then took that gospel home with him. Now, whether he joined a small group of believers, perhaps with Philemon, or even started another group himself, he's built up this connection, these communities, and that gospel has also then spread to the neighboring towns and resulted in several small household churches. The gossip that then went backwards and forwards and around the area was that there were these issues in the community. And Paul writes directly to the believers in the three towns, and Epaphras ends up spending time with Paul in prison. And of course, we're still talking about Epaphras even today. So he kind of makes it then leads to a question of, if each of us was a little bit more like Epaphras, carrying the gospel with us, what might God be doing, want to do here around us? Whether it be Southampton or Cardiff or in the States or wherever. And that gives me perhaps a question that we can first for the breakout room. As I said, it doesn't name much that is said directly, but there is a question or opportunity perhaps to imagine, to ponder, to even speculate and wonder how, where did the gospel reach Epaphras? And if in the next breakout room you finish that question quite quickly, then here's another one about where and how did the gospel reach you? Okay, so Stephen, time for the breakout room, first one. Well, here's a map of the area of what today is Turkey. It's kind of the southwestern part of the Asian part of Turkey. And the red spot represents Colossae, and you can see Laodicea and Hierapolis kind of nearby. They're all situated on in this valley called the river, around the river Lycus. The three of them are roughly between 100 and 120 miles east of Ephesus. 100, 120 miles east of Ephesus. And today, if you're going to drive 100 miles, you might think, a couple of hours will do it. But in those days, traveling that kind of distance on a road without mechanized transport is going to be a different deal. Quite a trek. In Roman times, this area was known as Asia Minor. And that's a little slip we need to remember. Now, today, the three towns are in ruins. I was going to put three pictures up, but they were all ruins, and a ruin is much like another ruin, so I didn't bother. Colossae is probably thought of as being the least glamorous of the three. It was situated at near a mountain called Mount Cadmus, which was known for cold, pure streams of water. Hierapolis is actually known as the sacred city, And tradition says it was founded by Apollos, and it had a temple to Apollos. It also had a cavern, which was probably the original version of plutonium, because it was noxious, poisonous. There's a volcanic area. Some church historians say that in years later, Philip the Evangelist, who you will probably hear of, if you think about Acts and traveling around Samaria and talking to an Ethiopian eunuch, that's Philip. Well, he ends up moving to Hierapolis at some point and is martyred there. Laodicea is another town that was founded and named after the wife of one of the Seleucid kings. This is the dynasty that came after Alexander the Great. And again, it doesn't say much about that, but Laodicea does get a mention in the book of Revelation. It's not a very positive one necessarily. It's criticized for being lukewarm. Lukewarm. Now, most commentators think that Ephesus is probably the most likely place where Epaphras would have met Paul and heard him speaking and teaching there. So in the ancient world, Ephesus was a major center of travel and commerce. It really was a big place. If Washington, DC was the equivalent of Rome, then Ephesus would have been New York or maybe Los Angeles. It's an important place. It's on the Aegean Sea. At the time, it was at the mouth of a river, which is all now silted up and miles away. But it's one of the greatest seaports of the ancient world. It was known because of this library of Celsus, because of the temple to Artemis or Diana, which was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, alongside the giant pyramid at Giza. And then it had obviously had its theatre. Well, this theatre is so large it could accommodate 25,000 people. That's 5 times the Royal Albert Hall, half the size, if you like, of the major football stadium, like Wembley and whatever. So it's actually a major, major place. There were 3 main roads that left the seaport in Ephesus. One went north, the other went south, and the third one went east towards Babylon, passing through Laodicea. Now, Paul. Let's think a little bit about Paul and how he teaches and so on. Acts 17 tells us that on his travels, it says here, as was his custom, Paul, when he went to a town, would visit the synagogue. And he would spend time there and he'd reason with them from scriptures and explain the Messiah, who Jesus was and what Jesus did. That was very much typical of what Paul would have done. It would seem reasonable to assume he might have done something similar in Ephesus, but it's kind of conjecture a little bit. As far as writing, he also tended to follow the same kind of format. He'd say what God has done, it's a bit of theology first, and then follow that with, so what? The practice of what that implications would be. So in Ephesus, we know from Acts 19 that Paul traveled there. Did he take that road that would have gone through Laodicea? Nobody seems to know. Everybody seems to think that he actually never visited and stayed at Colossae or Hierapolis or Laodicea. But anyway, it says he took the road through the interior to Ephesus. He found some disciples there and he went and spent time in the synagogue teaching. 3 months. Then it says, having been thrown out of the synagogue, actually, Paul then had discussions daily in a lecture hall, the lecture hall of Tyrannus, and this went on for 2 years. So that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. There we go. So it does seem that Ephesus is a good candidate for where Epaphras would have encountered and met Paul or heard his teaching. So here we go. Here's another thing. If we know that Paul's custom was to be talking about Jesus and the work that Jesus did, what else is he likely to have been talking about? This is guesswork. There are so many passages and so many areas things that we could pick up from our stone studies of the gospel, of the letters. But to me, I wonder about these. One that stands out for me is the question of that Paul wrote in Romans chapter 1 about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So there's a question of perhaps, was there a boldness about Paul? And he bold because it is power of God that brings salvation for everyone. Everyone who believes, the Jew to the Greek. A second message that Paul seemed to repeat in his various letters was to do with the transformation of society, of the community, so that the social orders that had been existed for a while were actually challenged. So there's no Jew or Gentile or Jew, doesn't matter. Circumcised, uncircumcised, no longer matters. Slave or free, no longer matters. What matters is the relationship with Christ. This is written to the Colossians, and as we said, we know that Paul got involved with the letter to Philemon about Onesimus the slave. In the breakout round, I asked you what actually attracted you to Christ, to the gospel, and I would wonder, would it be something to do with this? It's possible. There are other things he could have been. Lots to think about, what it could have been, what it might have been. Now, it's time to think about how we can follow Epaphras' example and carry the gospel with us. I want to share 5 passages that I'd like you to look at and we can discuss. Now, you're not going to do all 5, that'd be way too much, but to perhaps pick one of the 5, maybe 2 if you're ambitious and it's very obvious. But I think sometimes some of these are quite familiar, so you might just want to choose one that is less familiar. Here we go. Carrying the gospel, 5 ways. Matthew 5:13. It says, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus to the disciples. If the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out, trampled underfoot. Remember what I said about Laodicea in Revelation? They become tepid, tasteless, nothing to them. Well, obviously, the question that comes from this is then, what does that mean? What does it mean to be the salt of the earth? How can we be salt of the earth? So that's one option to talk about. Second one actually is in the verses that follow. This says, you are the light of the world. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So again, what does that mean? What would it mean for us to be the light of the world? So that's option number 2. Number 3 is 2 Corinthians 2 verse 12. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. But this picture, what does it mean? What does it mean to be the pleasing aroma of Christ? How do we do that? So we've got salt, we've got light, we've got aroma. 4th one in 1 Peter 3. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. So what does that mean? What is our hope in the context that we are living, working? How do we explain our hope? That's option number 4. Number 5. I can't read it on there. Move that. James. Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. So again, what does that mean for us? What actions needed? How do we respond? So there, 5 passages actually representing the 5 physical senses. And we can go back into and breakout rooms in again for another 15 minutes. And this is the question I want us to think about. How does God want to use you, me, to transmit the gospel? Whether it be salt and taste, or light and sight, aroma and smell, hope and hearing, or whatever it is. And then the question about what helps or hinders you from carrying the gospel effectively. Is that okay?
Sounds great, Phil. Do people need to take a photo of those questions so then they've got them there?
And like I said, of the 5 passages, don't try and tackle all 5 tonight. That will be too much. But try 1 or 2, and perhaps try 1 or 2 that you think are difficult, just to get the benefit of everybody sharing what I'm, how we might do that. Okay, we're back. Is everybody back? Okay. Well, sorry you didn't have an awful lot of time to think about all those different passages, but hope it was interesting in your group just to think about 1 or 2 of them. Steve, I think that's about all that I had planned to share.